I just made it all up. Sorry.
First of all, before I begin, I must appreciate the endeavor of the Rachel Carson Center, especially Christoph and Helmut, for encouraging this kind of an interdisciplinarity and this interdisciplinary studies with much emphasis on history at the Rachel Carson Center, and they invite people from all around the world to work here, and it's a great atmosphere. I must congratulate him and his team for doing all kinds of cooperation with the researchers. I'm also thankful to the research assistants and the library support that we get. We save a lot of time. They have been a great help for us. I must also thank fortunately, I got the great Don Foster as my office mate, and I got an opportunity to share thoughts with him, and I benefited a lot from his encouraging words. That was enough for me. My fellow colleagues, John, Moritz, Satoshi, Angela, they've all been quite nice, and they need appreciation for their comments on the early draft of my paper that I prepared for this colloquium. I would also once again thank Christoph for having agreed to sponsor the editing of my 6 hours of raw and amateur video shoot and make it a reasonably presentable documentary. The credit, I remember my mother, the credit for inspiring me to investigate on this topic goes a little bit to her. Whenever I was with her in Patna during my vacations, she used to complain to me about the long distance she used to cover to travel to reach to the Ganges. And the Ganges Bank, because she used to go to the Ganges Bank and worship there to the sun god. That's a family tradition. So she used to always tell me why it is happening, why it is going away from us. And it intrigued me also, but I talked to many people around. I talked to the scientists. They said that it's all happening because of the sedimentation taking place. And one day, I was working in an archive, and I came across one of the documents which suggested that there was some embankment effort made in this area. And then I started working in this field, say 2 years ago. In fact, even before that, when I was working on my artisan's thesis and the book, I somehow got an idea of this, that the Ganges was flowing, and then many factories were established by the British here in the Ganges Bank. But then I never thought of this issue, that why this Ganges has been shifting towards the north. And then last year, I had a project with my students. This happened for the first time in Delhi University, and in fact in India, that undergrad students were associated with professors to do a research field work. And that was an innovation done last year, and maybe this time also university will continue with this. But then I went with my students to the field work, and this is the video shoot which was done with the students only. And then I found that it was a project on sand mining, I tell you. And then during the project, I could realize that what has happened to this place. There are people, working in these sand mines. There are people working in the brick industries here. And where are they coming from? They are coming from the northern side of the Ganges. And then when I talked to them, I realized that it is actually because of the shifting of the Ganges River. So that was the beginning of my research on this topic. So I could clearly see some kind of a north and south contrast in this region. And that was the beginning of why I chose this topic to work on. My study was here to understand this changing course of the river historically, and then I just, unlike the geographers or maybe a scientist, because I got articles from the scientists and the geologists who suggested that why this sedimentation is taking place, or how the river. So they also use the historical maps. But then they were, it's only the historian who can tell you the cause I started working on that, and then I could find a lot of documents which suggested why such long-term shift has taken place. I should give you a rough idea of this Ganges River. This is the Ganges River. It flows from the Himalayas here, and you can see this is the river flowing, and then it goes into the Bay of Bengal, and this is roughly 2,500 kilometers. This is the area on which I have concentrated my study. It's a case study. So there could be, there have done a lot of work being done, but then, this area has remained somehow, till now, there was nobody who worked actually what has happened to the Ganges, why it is shifting. So I have worked in this area. I should give you a little bit on this Mid-Gangetic Basin, an idea. This upper section of the Ganges is actually, the Ganges flow very fast because it goes through the gorges and it comes down from the hills. So sediment load is too much. But when it enters into the plain area, it's called the Mid-Gangetic section. It is here that, the Ganges finds a plain, and suddenly the sediment load it spreads out. So when it goes into the plain area, the downward trend is not so steep, and the plain is very flat, so it spreads like anything. But when it reaches around Patna, so before Patna, you have a lot of, every year it meanders. But historically, if you see, when it enters Patna, there is no meandering taking place. Why I'm saying that there is a difference between a meandering and a shift, I'll tell you why. Because before, it is there near Patna that there are two Himalaya. These are the rivers. Ghaggar, Gandak, all these rivers are coming from this side. And they join the Ganges near Patna. So the geologists say, and the geographers say, that it is because of the rivers coming from the southern side, it pushes the river, from the northern side, it pushes the river towards the south. So that's why in this part, the river does not meander. It always touches the southernmost part of the boundary. Now, understanding this kind of a geomorphology of the region, then I could see, what has been happening in the past. This is a satellite image which shows that, how when there is a flood, this Ganges looks like, and this is a June 2011 picture, which is a normal Ganges flowing situation. I must also tell you something about the Diara land. Diara land is in the title you can see that there is a topic, word called Diara which has been mentioned. Diara is a large mass of land which has historically come over a period of time, long period of time, within the Ganges basin. Now sometimes many people, get confused and they use char land also for the Diara land, but there is a difference. Because char lands have this tendency, they are purely temporary kind of a land, and every year a new char land comes up. But in the Diara section, it's a permanent kind of a land, but it's an island within the Ganges. So that's the major difference. So sometimes people, use the word, sometimes they say that, okay, it's also a char land, but it's not a char land. It's a Diara land, and that's why in the region it's called a Diara land. And nowadays, Diara is often used as a metaphor for the hard conditions, the tough conditions that the people live there. So it's a metaphor for the people living there. So in this background, I would now like to show you, see, this is kind of Diara land that is existing. All these circles are the Diara land within the Ganges. Now, with this background, I would like to show you this documentary.
Of the Ganges in Patna, the capital of Bihar in eastern India, one can find a number of brick-making small units. These brick kilns, located along the main riverbeds, are half the year flooded with Ganges water. The water in the river starts receding in the month of October. So these low-lying areas remain without water for next 6 months. It is in these dry months that the brick-making activities take place along the Ganges River. The silt deposited along the banks are very fine and thin, as well as they are very smooth, and this makes the brick making out of the soil more easy and also makes the brick very strong. The amount of soil used for making bricks creates a huge pit in the brick manufacturing area, but this is again filled up with very fine silt during the annual flood. The workers in the brick industry are subject to extreme working conditions and poor remuneration. The brick molder families are contracted through middlemen, and usually they belong to very poor families. They are normally landless laborers of the surrounding region, and they are traditionally doing the brick making work in all these areas along the Ganges.
एक तो तुम हुआ, एक हमारा वाइफ हुआ, हमारा बेटा हुआ, और बहू हुआ, ये 4 काम करता है, 5 काम करता है, तो करीब 1000 रुपये इनकम मिल जाता है, खाना तो उसके बाद और क्या क्या यहाँ पर तुम्हारा बच्चा छोटा छोटा है, उसको पढ़वाते हो क्या करते हो, कैसे पढ़ाते हो? जरूर पढ़ना नहीं है, लेकिन मान लो कि थोड़ा बड़ा हो गया तो फिर क्या करोगे? अब वो क्या करता है, नहीं पढ़ता है 6 महीने वहाँ पर, उसके बाद वहाँ जो रहता है वहाँ पढ़ता है 6 महीना, और यहाँ नहीं पढ़ता है। यहाँ पर बाकी खाना वाना कहाँ बनाते हो? और ये सब बच्चा सब क्या करते रहता है जब तुम लोग काम करते हो? उसको नहीं खेलते रहता है।
Both male and female members of the families are engaged in brick making activities. Children are not employed as such, but usually they accompany their parents to the workplace. Thus the brick making jobs are performed by the husband-wife couple. However, there are no separate wages for the woman labor for jobs such as brick molding, which are performed together by several members of the family, and payments are made on piece rate to a family. Normally, the molding and the soil digging work is done by the male members, while the females do the soil mixing and carrying work. Female members would normally take the digged soil on a trolley to a mixer, where it is grinded in a small machine. From this grinding machine comes out a very soft and non-sticky and very thin clay, which is fit for molding the bricks. Then, this soft clay is carried by the female members to the people molding bricks. There is seldom any arrangement for the toilets or drinking water facilities for the laborers working in these brick kilns. The workforce is paid on the basis of quantum of work and against the completion of certain tasks. And as they have been paid on the basis of their family and not on the basis of the individual works, due to the seasonal nature of the brick industry, the workforce gets employment for a limited period of 6 months per annum.
6 महीने यहाँ से चले जाने के बाद क्या करते हो? खेती का काम करते हो, वहाँ कितना पैसा मिलता है? कितना 150 रुपया 200? हाँ, 100 रुपया पर एक दिन का मिलता है, एक आदमी। उसमें सब काम करते पूरा परिवार, 500 रुपया मिल जाता है पूरे परिवार को एक दिन का, है? उसमें तुम्हारा रोज का खर्चा चल जाता है, पैसा भी बचता होगा।
It closes down in the peak summer and monsoons. During this period, the workforce has to look for alternate options of earnings. Generally, they move out to the agricultural fields and get engaged as agricultural laborers. But on the advent of the next brick making season, employment in the same kiln. Therefore, this community has to undergo a job hunt every year after receding of the flooded river. After the molten process, the bricks are put in the sun for drying for a few days. The dry bricks are then set onto the kiln ready. The chimney attached to it is the most common in the region. In fact, the German Hoffman kiln technology is still not in use in India because it requires a huge investment. There is no doubt that these chimneys are very energy intensive and they emit profusely. Brick kilns along the Ganges in Patna has mushroomed over the last 60 years.
The shifting of the Ganges River by almost 10 kilometers ahead of Patna is another concern.
If one looks at the archival sources, the Ganges used to flow very close to the city. But then during the 19th and the early 20th century, the British government erected embankments to protect its military cantonment Danapur. The larger issue before the researchers is to find out as to why such brick-making units have proliferated in the region over the years. It needed to be explored that how historical changes in the river system have contributed to such landscape transformations. Long-term implication of this embanking the southern side of the Ganges was the acceleration. With the growth of the permanent settlement on these newly reclaimed land by brick-making units and other modern constructions, the Ganges spreads its way. People living in these Diara areas are no more left with agricultural land for the 6 months of the year, as it remains submerged in water completely, and they are available to them for only few months, during which they cultivate some pulses and a little bit of wheat if possible. The land now remains submerged in water for a longer duration, and they are left with nothing to produce and have been forced to migrate to work as laborers in brick-making units or in other fields.
With this background, I'll talk about this. I told you about this north-south contrast that we observed today. This story of embankment here. How historically this embankment was gradually made in the region, which led to the shifting of the Ganges towards the north. My first major argument actually comes out of this north-south contrast that we see there. The historical sources shed light on almost 2 centuries of policies of the British government, and later on also by the government which came after the British left. They could not somehow, because there were permanent embankments already being set up there. So they could not have changed it. What they could, have done was to increase the height of the embankment further up so that the flood water doesn't get inside the city. Now, during this period, I'll start the history from 1770s. It all started in 1787, first of all, because in the region. So that's why I'm not taking any history before that. But we just get an idea in the sources about how the Mughals reach there, or the army reaches there, and it goes back. It decides not to cross the river. So there are, certain references in the historical medieval sources which says that there were flooding all around it, but then there were no references of embankment ever made in those areas. So the first attempt for the embankment was made as such in 1787. This was the year by which time, the British had already set up their main factory here and a magazine, and also a cantonment called the Dinapur. It was a major cantonment, and it was the only cantonment in the region. This was a region, it's a larger province of Bengal, and they had got the Diwani right in 1765. So immediately after getting the Diwani right in 1765, they set up a military cantonment here. It was for two reasons. Number one, earlier on it was the Dutch who were, involved in saltpeter trade in this region. But somehow, they replaced the Dutch, and when they got the Diwani right here, in fact, the Dutch decided to go somewhere else, and the British took over the, control over the trade in this region. So they set up the factory here because, as Christopher was mentioning, that this was a region which was very famous for the saltpeter, and the Dutch had been doing it. So now, since the region was very famous for saltpeter, from all around the region, there was saltpeter coming to this bank, and then from here on, they started sending the saltpeter to Calcutta. That earlier on, the center of power was in Delhi. The Mughals used to rule from Delhi. Earlier on it was Agra, and later on it was shifted to Delhi. But it was for the first time that any center of power had actually emerged on the eastern side of the country. That was Calcutta. So it's actually on the where the Ganges actually meets the sea. It's around that. So for the first time, you find that there is a place which suddenly becomes very important for the British because it was close to the center of power at Calcutta. And it was, in fact, very easy for them because it was, the river was flowing to that side, that it was coming from western side to the eastern side. So it was easy to send a ship from west to east because it was, the river flow was on that side. And that's why it was very important for them. And it was because of this saltpeter that they established a major factory here, and it was for this reason that they established the first cantonment in the country in Dinapur. And it was a major cantonment, it radius. And so one of the major things that they wanted to do was to embank it. They had already created this cantonment in a flood-prone area. This was a flood-prone area, but they wanted to protect it. So they created, they faced a flood in 1773, and then there was another flood in 1780. So when the engineers, because at that time the engineers belonged to the military department. They were not a separate department, they belonged to the military department itself. So public works was actually with the military itself. So the engineers in the military suggested that we need to create an embankment if we want to save the factory and the cantonment area. So the first attempt by the British to build a cantonment was in 1787. And then we also get, the maps of those time. There is a map belonging to 1776. It's a Reynolds map which suggests that, the Ganges was flowing very close to the Dinapur cantonment and Patna. Then came Buchanan. There is a reference in Buchanan account, it's an 1811 account, which suggests, he clearly mentions that there has been, this Ganges always comes very close to the cantonment, and every year there is a sediment which gets deposited near the, cantonment and the factory area. And it's very difficult for for the ships to come closer to the factory because they wanted to, load the saltpeter. So they wanted the ships to come closer to the bank. But then he mentions that, every year there was a silt deposition in that area, and it was because of this, the military had to remove the silt in the region so that the ships come closer to the banks. So this is a clear-cut mention, and then Buchanan also produced a map of that region, and it shows that, the Ganges actually, by that time, was flowing very close to the cantonment. Then there was a major change which took place in the mid-19th century. There was a big debate going on between the military and the military engineers and the revenue officers. Now by that time, British government, East India Company had already established itself as one of the important powers in the region. They also got a lot of other areas in the surroundings, and they started collecting a whole lot of revenue from that area. So now the major concern was not only saltpeter. Now the major concern was also getting the revenue from that area. So in order to get the revenue, what they did was that they planned that this entire area of the Ganges should be protected. Now there are documents which suggest that every year the zamindars say that we won't be able to pay the rent because the entire area has been inundated. So listening to these complaints, the engineer suggested, and why not to embank the entire area? Because we have a reference in the Mughal document that suggests that this area was a highly productive area in terms of agriculture, and to the extent that the Mughal rulers in fact collected the highest rent from, this revenue from this region only. So this region had a history of highest production of grains in medieval period. And the British in fact had this knowledge that this is a highly productive area. So they somehow wanted, this area to be stable so that the revenue can be collected throughout the area and there is no complaint for, So at that very moment, when this kind of a debate is going on, we have a lot of documents which suggest that, there are military engineers debating with the revenue officers, saying that, we should, military is saying that we should not embank the entire area, and the revenue officers are saying that we should embank the entire area so that the huge area is protected for revenue collection. So this kind of, in the midst of this kind of a debate, there is a major change in the transportation. Suddenly, you find that the railways takes over. It becomes an important, mode of transportation for the British. Now, there is a story behind it. This was a period when, a lot of investment was coming from Britain. And, they were able to, we get reference that a lot of, there is some kind of debate among the officers saying that, how to attract the investment in these areas if we, should we go ahead with this Ganges embankment plan, or should we, create a railway so that, there is a lot of investment. We have people saying that railway has already made its entry in Europe and in England, so people are saying that why not to introduce railway also. So this kind of document is also found there. And then you find that all along the Ganges, there is a suggestion by the engineers that if we want to use the resources and all that, so it is better that we create a railway line which is very close to the Ganges. So it will not, there was, since a debate going on, people were saying that if we create a railway line